Hello, my name is John Combs. I'm a securities entertainment attorney. I work with low-budget independent feature filmmakers and documentary filmmakers, helping them comply with their federal and state securities laws when they're raising money from investors. One of a series of videos that I'm making, all related to the larger topic of investor financing of independent film, and I am available to answer your questions. There's my email address and my phone number, so if you have a question, get in touch. I'm not going to go into too much more detail about my background because it's all in writing and posted online at filmfinanceattorney.com, which is my website. Now, so let's start with the basics. What is a finder? And by the way, I get this question all the time. From independent producers. Can they use the services of finders? Can they pay them some form of compensation? And we're going to try to answer that question today. So it does come up. Federal securities laws, as the general rules, do not specifically define the term, and so we've come up with our own definition here, which is pretty simple. A finder is a person who brings together a buyer and seller in a financial transaction, and that's the minimum that they can do. Unfortunately, the general rule in this area is that finders are required to register as broker-dealers under federal securities laws if they engage in two activities here. They receive transaction-based compensation. That's one. Or the other is engage in pre-screening or pre-selling activities. Now, that's kind of a vague and general overview of a long list of activities, which we'll go into in a moment. To try to help you figure out what you can and cannot do. Finders, as a general rule, cannot perform the same tasks as broker-dealers in the sale of a security, because broker-dealers are trained, licensed, registered, and supervised, and finders are not. In other words, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, which has jurisdiction for the regulation of buying and selling securities, basically makes the judgment that if you're not trained and licensed and registered and supervised in the sale of securities, then you may be creating some problems for investors. And so the SEC is trying to protect investors. Now, finders generally are not registered, but in 3 states, New York, California, Texas, do allow finders to register for state law purposes, but that still doesn't impact the federal law, which still is that you're required to register as a broker-dealer if you engage in certain activities. So let's look at a list of what finders cannot do. It's a fairly comprehensive and long list, but not all, and it is based on an article published by Chad Cummings, an attorney out of Houston, who looked at this question, and I think did a pretty good job of listing of a lot of activities that just are not permitted for finders. So let's go through the list. The finders cannot participate in discussions between the company and prospective investors. In the case of a film offering, an independent film offering, usually we're talking about a manager-managed LLC as the company. So the finder can't participate in discussions between those two. A finder cannot negotiate terms of the securities transaction. Can't get involved in setting the price for the offering. Can't insist in structuring the securities transaction. In other words, can't advise the filmmaker, for example, whether to use a limited partnership as the investment vehicle or to use a manager-managed LLC. Typically, these days, it's manager-managed LLC. The finder cannot, and this is a big one, the finders cannot receive transaction-based remuneration. That is a commission or some form of compensation that is tied to the size of or the success of the securities offering or any individual transaction. Finders cannot conduct or assist with the sale of securities. And finders cannot provide advice regarding the value of securities. They cannot locate issuers of securities on behalf of investors. In other words, that's turning the transaction around and representing the finders, representing the investors in that case, and trying to find investment opportunities. Finders cannot handle customer funds and securities. And finders cannot actively find investors. Now, that sounds a little odd. But what they're really saying is that they can't be in the business of going out and finding investors. If they know somebody or know a few people and refer them to you and merely introduce the buyer and the seller, that's okay. The finders cannot forward or send the PPMs or the private placement offering memorandum or the subscription documents to these prospective investors. So that's a pretty thorough list of things that finders cannot do. And there's a shorter list of what finders can do, which we'll look at on the next slide. But again, this comes from the Chad Cummings, his own law journal article, as I understand it. So you might want to go there, because there are a few more that I didn't get to include on this slide. I mean, there's a limited amount of space. So now here's a shorter list of what finders can do. Okay. They can introduce prospective investors to issuers or promoters without further involvement in their discussions. So that pretty much is what the definition of a finder is. They can introduce buyer and seller. Finders can also actually receive, and this is confusing, but they can actually receive compensation for making introductions if the compensation is not tied or based on the success of the raising of capital. In other words, no commissions. Can't do those traditional 5% of the money raised kind of deals with finders. And if done more than once, such a person may be deemed in an unregistered broker-dealer, which is not permitted. Thus, the ability of a finder to operate without a broker-dealer license is extremely limited based on the law. What can we conclude from this? There's not much a finder can do without crossing the line into activities that may trigger the requirement to register as a securities broker-dealer. Now, according to the SEC, no one factor alone will determine whether a finder should register as a broker-dealer, and the SEC will consider all factors together in making such a determination, and some factors may carry more weight than others. For example, as we've discussed, transaction-related remuneration. That's really the key, but not the only factor that is going to be considered. Now, as a consequence, both the finder and the issuer can be prosecuted under SEC regulations. The SEC treats transaction-based compensation as the most important thing, as the hallmark of broker-dealer activity, even if the finder never handles investor funds. If an unregistered finder solicits investors and is paid upon closing, after the funds become available to the producer, regulators can still view the finder as acting as a broker and the issuer as an aider and abettor. Again, the issuer is the filmmaker group. Such a determination exposes both the finder and the issuer to enforcement risks, potential rescission rights. In other words, you may be forced to give the investor's money back after it's already spent, and that's awkward. And it also delays the offering. Now, this presentation, this information, is based on some sources. Remember the old saying, no citations, no credibility, which is a little bit of an exaggeration. But anyway, in 2024, I wrote a book, Investor Financing of Independent Film, published by Focal Press. It's available. And it had a chapter in that book with a section on finders. And it was partly based on this article, Finders and Unregistered Broker-Dealers. And then in 2025, Chad Cummings came out with his article, How to Structure Finders Fees Without Violating Broker-Dealer Regulations. Now, that sounds a little promising. It sounds like Chad believes that he can somehow solve this problem. And I think what he's saying is that if you list all of the things finders cannot do, and they don't do any of those things, then you're okay. But that's just saying, okay, finders are people who introduce buyers and sellers, and that's it. But the other problem is that finders don't always abide by that list of things they can do, and so there's a risk there. But anyway, you might want to check out Chad Cummings' article. Now, this is just a summary of what we covered. We've learned that finders cannot perform the same tasks as registered broker-dealers, and there's a long list of things finders can't do. The source, Chad Cummings' article. There's a shorter list of what finders can do. They can introduce buyers and sellers. They can be compensated for non-transaction related tasks. But if compensated more than once, finders are acting like unregistered broker-dealers. No. SEC considers many factors in determining whether a finder acted improperly, and transaction-related remuneration carries the most weight, more weight than the other factors. The ability of a finder to operate without a broker-dealer license, extremely limited. I'm sorry, but that's what the law is. Now, other topics in this series include what's a security. It's really important for independent filmmakers to know that, because there are a whole set of rules that apply to that transaction if you're selling a security. And in most instances, as we learned in one of the presentations, investor financing of independent films involves the sale of security. Securities compliance, just an overview presentation, is also one of these videos. The disclosure controversy, there's a lot of controversy in the film industry about what needs to be disclosed to prospective investor, what is required, but more importantly, what should be disclosed. And we discussed that in that presentation. Then there's also a video about, well, what happens if we don't comply with the securities laws? Well, there are a number of different possible consequences, none of which are happy endings. And then there's a video presentation on the SEC notice filings, which a lot of people never really get to in their investigation into this area. And then I also did one on financial projections, because the SEC has a policy about financial projections, and a lot of people in the film industry are not aware of that. So that's another possibility. So that concludes our presentation on finder's fees. I hope you find this information helpful, even if it's not what you wanted to hear. I'm just reporting on the state of the law with respect to finder's fees, and I hope you'll check out some of these other videos that relate to investor financing of independent film and find some useful information there. So thank you for joining us, and goodbye.